In this episode, we'll take a look at the Aputure Nova P300C LED RGBWW light. First of all, I want to start off this review by saying that this is really a professional level light. Now, many of us that are shooting passion projects that are completely self-funded probably can't afford this light. For those of you that are in that boat, totally understand. What I want to talk about from your perspective is, what does a pro level light have that a consumer grade light does not have? So first of all, who is this light for? Aputure in their own marketing material says it's for pros, for independent filmmakers, and for rental houses. So they're talking about film projects that have a budget. We're not talking about self-funded films. So there's an important distinction there. The light does come in at $16.99 US. With the additional rolling hard case, it comes in at $18.99, and you can also buy a softbox kit for it that comes in at $149 US. So what is it that makes this light, a professional light, different from consumer grade lights? Let's talk through some of the things. First of all, color quality, is that part of it? And light output. Well, first of all, here are the photometrics. You can see that the spectral similarity index score, when you set the light to 3200 Kelvin, tungsten colored, comes out at 85. That is the best reading I've seen on an LED light ever. So in terms of the current state of the art as far as LED lighting instruments are concerned, this has very high color quality when you're shooting at 3200 Kelvin. Now, when you move it to daylight, 5500 Kelvin, we came in with a measure of 74 on the spectral similarity index. And the spectral similarity index metric, for me, is probably one of the more interesting ones and more useful ones at a practical level, because what it does is it compares the output, the spectral output of this light, or any light, compared to a known source. And so what that tells you basically is, how different is this from a standardized known source? So daylight, for example, we pretty much know what the spectrum of the sun is at D5500. That's a standard. We also know what the spectral output of a tungsten light is at 3200 Kelvin. So when we make those comparisons, what this score, SSI, is telling us is how much different is it. If you get a number in the 60s, what that means is you are very likely to experience color rendering errors in your footage. And so that's something important to keep in mind. If you get up into the 70s, you're less likely to experience a lot of color rendering issues. And then if you get into the 80s and 90s, then you're even less likely. So you really ideally like to see lights in the mid to upper 70s and higher. And this light does very well on both of those. Now, if you're interested to see the old school measurements like CRI or TLCI or even TM30, those are available here as well. Now, in terms of light output, this is roughly the same size as an Arri SkyPanel S30. And so it's not shaped like a 1x1, but the surface area is just barely bigger than a 1x1. So just so you're aware, it's not a 2x1, even though it is a more horizontal format. And so really this light is comparable to an Arri SkyPanel S30. And that light, the color version of that light, comes in at over $4,000. So that helps to put some perspective on what Aputure has done here in terms of competing with some of the other lights in the pro market. Now, the light output in lux, these are all measurements, by the way, that I took with my Seikonic C800 spectrometer, came in at over 10,000 lux at 3200 Kelvin and even higher at daylight. So this is putting out quite a lot of light for a soft light source. Now, what's important to remember, and a lot of people that are first getting into lighting don't realize this, but the beam angle of the light output from the light has a huge influence on these types of measurements. So for example, if you have a light with a 40-degree beam angle, all those photons are being shot forward in a 40-degree beam. And so at 1 meter away, you're going to measure a lot more photons than if that same light had a 120-degree beam angle. Now, this particular light has a 120-degree beam angle. So it's a very soft light. It has a very wide beam angle. It can throw light out into a large space, but yet it's still putting out a lot of light. So while that 10,000 lux may not seem big if you compare it to a COB light with a reflector and maybe a narrower beam, it is a lot of light. One thing that I see on a lot of the consumer lights is they typically will have, if they are bicolor, for example, they'll have the ability to set the color temperature between 3200 Kelvin and 5500 or 5600 Kelvin, so daylight and tungsten, somewhere in there. And a lot of times what I have found when I make measurements on those is if I set it to 3200 Kelvin and then I measure it with my spectrometer, I find that it's actually not 3200 Kelvin. In some cases, it's off by 400 degrees. And so that's kind of something that I've noticed a lot on the more consumer-oriented lights. Here on this one, we were much closer. So when you set it to 3200 Kelvin, you're pretty darn close, definitely within 100 degrees. Another thing that we see on the more consumer-oriented lights is you're always hoping that it's not going to have a green cast or a magenta cast. And if it does, there's really nothing you can do other than gel it. So gelling takes time, and it's a little bit kind of labor-intensive. It takes a while, you have to figure it out. With this light, what's really nice is that you have a setting so you can adjust the green-magenta balance. So if you have too much green, you can dial in some magenta and get it dialed back in so that it's perfectly balanced. That's a really, really nice feature. Now, not only does it correct for any potential inaccuracies in the light itself, and I should also mention that LEDs have a tendency to green up over time. So the more hours you have on the LEDs, the more green they tend to become. So having that adjustment will be really nice once you've got a lot of hours on the light. But in addition to that, when you're working in environments like I do in corporate video, where you have to match existing light, you might want to go ahead and match, however green or magenta those particular lights you're working in with this light so that there isn't any sort of contention and you don't get these weird colors in your video footage. In terms of light output with the softbox on, just to give you a sense for what kind of output we are getting here, if I put the light 2.5 meters away, turn it to full power on 3200 Kelvin, I got a meter reading of f8 at 23.976 frames per second, 180 degree shutter angle, which is roughly 1/48th of a second, at ISO 400. And so hopefully that can give you a sense for how much light this can put out. It is definitely sufficient for a key light, for interviews or talking heads. And if you are not using the softbox, of course, then you can put out a lot more light as sort of a flood. Build quality. Now that's one thing that people obviously assume when you're talking about a pro level light. The reality is that when lights get regular use out on set, they get banged up pretty badly, pretty quickly. And so build quality is really important. And I feel like from what I've seen so far on the P300C, this thing is made out of metal and some really dense plastics. So it feels like it's going to hold up really nicely. And I'm told from Aputure that they've actually sent these to a lot of the rental houses that serve the filmmaking community. And we will see how they hold up pretty well over time. But my experience has been with the pro level and the prosumer level lights from Aputure that they're doing really well in terms of build quality. This looks like it's no exception. And in fact, I would say this appears to be the sturdiest looking light that Aputure has built to date. Now, the ability to power the light through a variety of means is also very important, and the light comes with an AC power cable that's a 6 meter long cable, very high quality, very sturdy. I like that it's 6 meters as well, so you don't have to carry around as many stingers or extension cables when you do go on set, so that's really nice. But you also have a DC input option that can take 24 to 48 volts, so that's not going to work with a single Cine battery. But there are a couple of options coming. Number one, from Aputure, they're going to create this power station that allows you to connect a couple of Cine batteries, and that can power this. Or you could use existing block batteries. So if you're going to be out in a location where you don't have any sort of AC power, there are block batteries out there that can supply that 24 to 48 volts. Another thing that's really important when you're looking at pro-level lights is what light modifiers are they compatible with. And the nice thing here is that not only has Aputure made a bespoke softbox, well, that is to say a softbox that's made specifically for this light model, but they also are compatible with lighting modifiers from a number of other companies, including DOP Choice, Chimera, and Honeycrates. On pro-level lights, you're typically looking for lights that also have remote control capabilities, and specifically up until now, to a large extent, that's come in the form of DMX inputs and outputs, 5-pin DMX XLR inputs and outputs. And those work great if you're in studio. They're not used quite as much on set, although sometimes they can be. What's interesting is that this has that on the control box. Actually, there's a DMX in and out 5-pin XLR, but it also is capable of working with their Sidus Link app. So that runs on iPhone, Android, and on iPad. And what's really nice about that is it creates a mesh network. So all of the lights from Aputure that they're putting out now have this SIG mesh capability. And you can, from a single app, you can actually connect to your entire lighting setup and even if you're pretty far away, if the closest light will be the one that your phone connects to, and then it creates a mesh network from there. What's really nice about the app as well is that in addition to that, it can also do some interesting things. There's a color picker, and there's also the ability to take a photo with your mobile device, and then the light can match that color, which is super, super helpful and really nice to be able to use something like that on set if you're trying to match another existing light. Now, fans and noise, that's another consideration. When you have a light that's this powerful and puts out this much light and has its power supply integrated into the head itself, there is a requirement for a fan, so it has to move air. In this particular case, the light is about 2.5 meters from me. And I'm just being quiet here so you can see if you can hear that. I can hear it a little bit. I'm not sure if you're hearing it or not. We're using a boom microphone just out of the frame right here. But what is clear is that they have put some engineering into it to make sure that that fan isn't ridiculously loud. It isn't like one of the older generation Red cameras, which made just an absolute racket. All right, so let's talk about some of the unique features of the Nova that we haven't covered yet. We did do a flicker test just to make sure that we weren't getting any sort of flicker. Now, I don't have a high-speed camera, but we did go up to 1/785th of a second, and we didn't run into any problems. If you are going to do some sort of high-speed shooting, there is an option to change the frequency of the light, and that way you can potentially avoid any sort of flicker issues. So that's a really nice feature that I haven't seen in any other lights. Now, one of the things that's also unique about this light is it's an RGBWW light. What that means is it has red LEDs, green LEDs, and blue LEDs, but in addition to that, it has two types of white LEDs, cool white and warm white. And so what that allows you to do is actually tune the color temperature, if you're just using it, for example, as a key light and not as an effect light with an RGB color. What that allows you to do is go all the way down to 2000 Kelvin and all the way up to 10,000 Kelvin. So that gives you a really nice wide range instead of having just a single white LED and then having to mix in some of the RGB to kind of approximate some of those other color temperatures. It's a really nice feature, gives you a lot of options. On the Yoke, the receiver is actually a junior, or you can also use it on a baby pin. So it really is a heavy light. It comes in at 23 pounds for the light head itself. It's another pound for the control box. So that comes in at about 10.4 kilograms for the light head. That's a pretty substantial light. So you're not going to be putting this on some of those really lightweight photography light stands that you sometimes seen out there. You really need a C-stand, or you need to attach it with the junior receiver. As I mentioned before, there is an accessory slot on here that will accommodate the Aputure light box that they've already released with the light, but you can also use DOP choice modifiers as well as those from Chimera and Honey Crate. So you have a variety of options, both in terms of softboxes and also for grids. Now, the softbox that Aputure makes is actually quite nice. It includes a 40-degree grid. So not only do you get the nice soft light, but it also controls where the light spills. And at $150, it's really a bargain. The control box is really interesting because it can be mounted to the back of the light if you choose to do that, but it also comes with a stand quick release plate, so you can also mount it on the stand. So if you're going to be putting it up quite high, then you can put the controller on the stand, which makes it a little easier to manage. The controller is really good. It has an OLED screen, which is very effective. They've put a lot of thought into the design of the screen, and it has several different knobs that make it very easy to adjust the parameters for whatever you're doing in that particular case. One thing that I really like that they've included on the control box that I haven't seen on their previous lights are preset buttons. So you can very quickly jump to different presets and get exactly where you need to go very quickly. There are a variety of different color modes. So there's an HSI mode, which is probably my favorite when I'm going to be doing sort of different types of effects like you see on the back wall here. The HSI mode is where you can set the hue, how saturated the color is, and how bright it is or how intense it is. Really easy way to work. There's also an RGB mode if you prefer to mix the three different colors together to get where you want to go. There's also an XY mode, which I haven't seen before in other pro level lights, at least the ones I've seen. So that's really nice as well if you're trying to match a particular color on an XY basis. And then of course there's also the color temperature mode called CCT. So if you just need to go into, for example, 3200 Kelvin or 5500 Kelvin or 5600 Kelvin for daylight, you can quickly dial that in as well. There are also a variety of different effects, and again, I at first thought these were a little cheesy when I first saw them come out on the lights a couple of years ago, but they're actually quite useful. There's a fire, candle, TV, lightning, explosion, cop car, color chase, and a bunch of others as well. Now, what's interesting about the control box, it also has a USB port and is firmware upgradable. So we could potentially see some additional firmware upgrades that extend the capabilities of the system, but also potentially add some additional effects. As I mentioned before, the light head itself comes in at 23 pounds or 10.4 kilograms, and the control box adds another pound to the weight overall. So overall, it's a pretty sturdy light. And it's pretty heavy, so you're definitely going to want to work with C-stands, again, or a lighting grid that takes, the junior receiver. Again, the light comes in at $16.99 US, and if you buy it in the kit with the case, it comes in at $18.99, and the softbox comes in at $149 USD. So hopefully I answered all of your questions, but if I did not, go ahead and leave your questions down below. Hope that was helpful, and if you have not already subscribed, make sure you do that, and we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.